Ancient Origins of the Celts, Ancient Civilizations documentary. I really have high expectations for this because it's a topic I love. So without further ado, let's jump right into it.
When the Celtic people are mentioned, we think of images of painted warriors and mysterious druids, and a defeated warlord knelt before the might of the Roman eagle. It might remind
Glory to Rome.
One of the rolling hills of Wales, the rugged highlands of Scotland, or the Moher Cliffs of Ireland, where echoes of their ancient languages are still spoken today. Shared Celtic heritage is still dear to tens of millions of people worldwide. But who exactly were the ancient Celts? Welcome to our new series, covering a 1,500-year historical span of Europe's most enigmatic peoples. The sponsor of this video, Dungeon Fog.
You know what? This is really exciting. I like that he mentioned painted people because I have a lot to say about the actual paints, the body paints that Celtic people use. But I want to see if they go dive into it before speaking.
Was kind enough to create Celtic-themed assets on its platform just for this video.
Ooh.
So what is Dungeon Fog? It's
Man, those look nice.
a free online map maker and authoring tool created by dedicated gamers of tabletop RPG.
Well, that's lovely. It's a cool sponsor though. Let's go into the facts.
Clicking the link in the description. Don't forget that these ads support our channel and allow us to continue our work. For the most part, the ancient Celts left virtually no written records of their own existence, so we are reliant
That's correct.
almost solely on limited archaeological and etymological evidence to piece together their culture, while in the centuries leading up to the birth of Christ, a scattering of Greek and Roman writings give us a slightly more dynamic window into their society. Neither offer a complete survey of the Celtic world, but they provide us with a workable set of information that, in lieu of anything else, we have no choice but to rely on. The most popular narrative of the Celtic Genesis can be found in the town of Hallstatt.
Celtic Genesis. Okay, so I'm gonna be a little pedantic. I mean, that's me. Allow me to be a little pedantic. That's why we're here anyways. Not an attack, but I'm saying Hallstatt, the place of salt, it's Proto-Celtic. Now, he did say Genesis, but if you want to talk about Celtic proper, then it's Latin. So Hallstatt is really, really Proto. Maybe he'll say it. He did say Genesis, so it's not an attack, just a clarification.
Which sits nestled against a lake between the idyllic peaks of the Alps.
The Alps, yeah.
It was here, between the years of 1846 and 1863, that an Austrian mine operator, known as Johann Georg Ramsauer, excavated the derelict cemetery of an ancient salt mining community. The material culture discovered here was named the Hallstatt culture after the town it was discovered in, and is widely considered to be the birthplace of an early Celtic society.
Okay, he did say early Celtic. To be specific, it's Proto-Celtic.
The Hallstatt culture has since been broken up into 4 chronological phases, based on the evolution of artifacts found in its sites.
Yeah.
Hallstatt A and B emerged in the late Bronze Age between 1200 to 800 BC in Central Europe. It was initially a minor deviation of the Indo-European Urnfield complex, an older material culture prominent across much of Central Europe.
So far, the animations are fantastic. I love the map. I love the art style, and the information is really good. Did you notice that some of northern Italy is marked as Celtic? And that is absolutely correct. There are 2 specific places, Gola Secca and Canegrate, which are absolutely Celtic Iron Age cultures, a little later than this. But yeah, northern Italy was 100, because usually when we think of the Celts, you either think of the Brittonic Celts, including England, not just Wales, Ireland, Scotland, but England too. I mean, think of Cornwall. Then you think of the Iberian Celts, you think of course, Gauls, of France and all that. But in reality, northern Italy was absolutely Celtic. Absolutely Celtic.
Hallstatt's society was based on mining salt, copper and tin, and trading them to outlying regions. These were crucial products, for salt was used to preserve meat in winters, while copper and tin were used to forge bronze, the most
That is an interesting choice of color. He went for a reddish bronze in the animation here. I would have gone for a dull golden bronze because it's an axe head. A little nitpick here, but I'm doing it in good faith. Okay, I'm doing it because it's a nice video up to this point. I'm really enjoying it. I'm just saying I would have chosen that color. I think is more representative of axe heads and spearheads and swords and armor. of the period when it comes to bronze.
Precious metal of the era. The peoples of the Hallstatt heartland grew prosperous from this trade, which remained a core part of their economy for centuries to come. Around 800 BC, ironworking was introduced to the Hallstatt through trade with the Hittites and Greeks. This started the Hallstatt Sea era, where the Proto-Celts came into their own as a culture distinct from the Urnfield complex.
Yep.
They built hill forts throughout Central Europe, populating them with artisans and warriors, led by petty chieftains.
You know, it's really making me want to play one of those like old school civilization games like 3. Regardless, so I love the topic of the Celtic forts. I've been working on this for a while, and I'm producing a dedicated, very detailed video on the Oppida Oppidum, the fortified hill villages. Although then again, it's a lot deeper than you would think once you actually dive into the sources, and there is some misinformation about it. So I'm not going to comment too much on the Oppida because I'm going to make a dedicated video just to let you know that that's going to happen, I want to say this month, but probably beginning of February.
It was at this point in the early Iron Age that they started developing a class system and social inequality, becoming more hierarchical. Graves excavated.
To be honest, social inequalities probably existed since the first tribe, because when you have a tribe leader and you have a warrior class and hunters, well, already the tribe leader, there is social inequality. I mean, I don't think it began here. I think it just exists in the way that it is what it is. But he's absolutely right in mentioning chieftain and warrior class, because it is a warring aristocracy in the Iron Age. There will be the typical warriors that are leading and ruling the early Celtic realities.
From the Hallstatt A and B eras were uniformly simple and egalitarian in nature. However, burials from Hallstatt C onwards show a great disparity in wealth and status. Clustered around their hill forts were great barrow mounds, the resting place of wealthy tribal elites. Here, nobles were buried alongside their treasures such as collars, brooches, axe heads, and other metalworks of bronze, iron, and gold. These valuables oft featured iconic geometric designs and animalistic motifs. The presence of ivory and amber in these barrows suggests that they maintained trade networks that extended as far out as the Baltics and North Africa. Equestrianism was likely a symbol of power and nobility during this era, evidenced by the presence of a distinct style of slender slashing sword present in many graves, best suited for cavalry warfare. Additionally, the highest tribal elites were buried alongside ceremonial bridles, tackles.
I hate the word ceremonial. I really like that artist though, an animator.
And ornate horse-drawn cult wagons. The importance of the horse in aristocratic society was likely due to contact with the Indo-Iranian Cimmerians, from whom they adapted the horse and wagon as symbols of tribal power. It was perhaps through the mobility of the horse and their economic and cultural soft power that the Hallstatt peoples expanded out of their traditional heartland and exported their cultural influence across much of Central Europe.
You know, since we are looking at it's an interesting theory, where it came from, the idea of the wagon. But since we're looking at this, one can't help but thinking in a military context, the idea of war chariots. And what's interesting about war chariots is that they were used it's one of those elements that can show the difference between continental Celts and insular Celtic realities. I already mentioned this in a few videos, but a while ago. It's possible that if you're a recent subscriber, you haven't seen that. But the continental Celts, like the Gauls, used to fight with war chariots, but then they abandoned them and they become obsolete. With that being said, Brittonic Gauls, instead, in England, for instance, modern day England, they kept it. That's probably because, and that's a pet opinion of mine, but islands tend to be more socially, culturally, and militarily conservative and linguistically conservative than continental realities that are more in contact with, for instance, in this case, the Gauls having to deal with Mediterranean powers all the time. So they had to change a lot of things because there is a pressure in islands That's why Icelandic is probably closer to Old Norse. It's separated. That's why Sicilian and Sardinian have still got, in the case of Sardinian, but even Sicilian, both languages, Sardinian more, have a lot of connection with classical Latin in terms of syntax, word structure, pronunciation, and that sort of stuff. I think that's why I think islands freeze cultures in time. Whereas continental realities like the Gauls, they evolve due to pressures that islanders are not subject to. And so basically, if you were a Celtic man from Gaul and you traveled to Britannia, which they did, by the way, to study with the Druids over there, it must have felt like you went back hundreds of years, because you would find an ancient reality frozen in time. It is fascinating stuff.
The transition from Hallstatt C to D occurred around 600 BC and was marked by
Respect for saying BC. He gained 10 points with me.
The culture shifting west along the Danube, Rhine and Seine rivers, gravitating towards the Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille. The Phocian Greeks of Massalia were the early Celts' gateway to the riches of the Mediterranean world. Through them they imported all sorts of southern luxuries, including fine pottery, glass, and the most precious luxury of all, wine. Late Hallstatt peoples
My dad would agree.
soon began trading with other Mediterranean peoples, including the Phoenicians and the Etruscans, whose advanced civilization we've covered in a previous episode.
I'll have to check
The
it out.
first historical mention of the Celts came in 517 BC from the Greek historian Hecataeus of Miletus, who referred to the people living beyond Massalia as Keltoi. This word was possibly borrowed from a tribal endonym, or was Greek for the tall ones, contributing to the enduring stereotype that the average Celt stood a head taller than their Greco-Roman counterparts.
Okay, let me comment on that. So I think it's the first. I do believe it's an endonym. For those of you who are not familiar, you've got endonyms and the opposite is exonyms. An endonym is a term that refers to a place, a people, a language, and it's made by that very people. So it's how people call themselves or how the residents of a specific area call that area. An exonym, on the other hand, is how foreign people or people from a different culture or reality call them. So I'll give you a modern example and I'll give you a period example. An idea of a modern endonym would be the word Nihon for Japan, the word Nihongo for Japanese language, and the word Nihonjin for Japanese person. And because it's how the Japanese call themselves and their land and their language. But an exonym would be Japan, Japanese, and Japanese for the language. These are exonym because it's how other cultures, in this case Western cultures in connection to Portuguese, and the early explorers, European explorers, that's how they built it because, through Chinese and all that stuff. In the period, we have a fantastic saying, and I don't get to use this one very often, so it's nice to say it. Julius Caesar says, open quotes, ipsorum lingua Celtae, nostra Galli appellantur. So if we take this Latin sentence, ipsorum lingua, so lingua means language, ipsorum, it's like their own. It can be translated, or actual is another way to translate. So in the actual language, or in their own language, ipsorum lingua Celtae. So in their own language, Celts. And then he says nostra, with omitting, because it's understood by context, language. So nostra meaning in ours, he's saying, in ours, Galli, so Gauls, appellantur. We call them or we refer to them or name them. So Julius Caesar, who had direct contact with Celtic populations, because that's how he writes the De Bello Gallico, so he has this war of invasion, meets the continental Celtic realities, and remember that Julius Caesar went to Britain. He didn't manage to conquer it, you'll have to wait for Claudius, but he did go. So he's an eyewitness to both continental Celts and insular Celts. And he tells us that in their language they are Celts, Celtae. He's kind of Latinizing it because he's speaking and writing in Latin, but definitely it's clear that the stem is Celt something, probably just Celt, and then he makes the suffix to create a plural in Latin. So he says in their language it's Celtae, that's how they call themselves, but we call them Gauls, Galli, and Gallia with a long A when it comes to phonemic vowel length, when it comes to the area. But it's very likely that instead, probably the term Gaul comes from a single tribe, and maybe the Romans extended that to all of them, at least in that area. When it comes to insular Celts, they do distinguish them, the Romans do distinguish them from the continental Celts, but it's important to underline that the Romans do not consider them separate, the ones in England, in Britain, from the ones in Caledonia, so Scotland. There is a difference, of course, between Gaelic, Scottish, Brittonic, Irish, absolutely, but from the perspective of a Roman, for the way they write, both not only Julius Caesar, which is the famous one, but to mention another one, Pomponius Mela, Roman geographer, they say, no, they're the same, they're all Celts. They do not distinguish. I do not believe it's because of ignorance. I do believe it's because they still weren't distinct enough, culturally, linguistically, and religiously, for the Romans to perceive them as different political entities. They will become different political entities, but you've got to wait until the 3rd century AD. If I'm not wrong, I didn't do a deep research for this one, but I'm saying for the Romans there was no difference. In fact, the only difference that the Romans mentioned, this is fascinating, between the Celts of southern Britain and the Celts of Scotland is the color of the hair, because they say that the southern Celts of southern England were blonde, but the northern Celts of Scotland tended to be more redhead, and that's it, pretty much. Isn't that fascinating?
Either way, it is a term that we still use today.
Yep.
Late Hallstatt chieftains consolidated a great amount of power by virtue of the foreign wealth they controlled. The many small hill forts that dotted the landscape were largely replaced by fewer but larger population centres, such as the ruins of an impressive tribal complex at Hohenberg in southern Germany. Meanwhile, the barrow mounds became more splendourous than ever before, inlaid with luxury imports from Greece and Etruria. By around 500 BC, the Hallstatt culture had reached its peak in wealth, territory, and influence. But how can we be sure that the Hallstatt material complex represents the early development of a distinct Celtic culture?
Yeah, it does.
First of all, the swords found in late Hallstatt graves closely resemble the weaponry that Greco-Roman writers described the Celts using in later centuries.
True.
Secondly, the importance of the symbolic horse and wagon in burials was considered an early form of later Celtic funeral rites, which saw chieftains buried within two-wheeled war chariots. The geometric and animalistic art style of the late Hallstatt era is accepted to be an early form of Celtic artwork, and perhaps most importantly, the name Hallstatt itself is derived from an old Celtic word meaning salt place.
Yep.
This is reinforced by the fact that in the Celtic languages of Welsh, Cornish and Breton, the words for salt are Halwyn, Halloin and Hollain, presumably cognates of the same ancient root as...
Hey, so far, pretty good. I've got to say, you did a very good job.
The evidence all seems to suggest that the Hallstatt heartland was where the Celts emerged as a visible people group, featuring an early form of the Celtic language, tribal hierarchy, and artistic expression. However, this theory has its problems. Although by the late Hallstatt period, artifacts belonging to the culture would be found from Britain to Croatia, it did not mean that all the peoples in these lands were early Celts. Additionally, not all Celtic speakers in
of course, because you also have indigenous people.
The early Iron Age would have belonged to the Hallstatt culture. The early Celtic language that became associated with the Hallstatt heartland developed out of an older Indo-European tongue around 1500 BC, and over centuries spread across much of Central and Western Europe. People on the periphery of the early Celtic world adopted the Proto-Celtic tongue due to the cultural and economic influence of the Hallstatt elites, but did not necessarily adopt the material culture. For example, Ireland and parts of Spain were predominantly Celtic-speaking by the 5th century BC, but the Celtic migrants there had mixed with the indigenous populations of those regions to form the Celtic...
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because often when we talk about the migrations of the Angles, the Saxons, when they go to England, it's not like they completely replace and eradicate the people, like in the sense that they would butcher every single one of them. No, they mix. Sometimes they become a ruling elite. That's similar to what happened with the Normans after the Battle of 1066. They don't replace the Anglo-Saxons at that point. They rule over them as a ruling elite. The Normans, and that's what often happens, which is why, I mean, it does happen sometimes, so you have entire people's dislocation, and dislocation, there is a word for it, I can't remember it, I don't remember the technical term, but It does happen sometimes, so you have a complete moving of a people, but it's very rare in history, as opposed to situations in which you have a new ruling class or a new ruling elite or an intermixing of realities. That is more often the case, which is one of those reasons why I strongly reject the idea of a 100% black Egypt, because the idea that, then the Middle Eastern people arrived and removed every single one of them and replaced them completely. It just doesn't happen. It is much more likely, and I will defend this until overwhelming evidence changes my mind, but I will defend this. It is far more likely that Egypt was a multi-ethnic reality, just like this Celtic reality that they are talking about here would have been multi-ethnic, but even more so with Egypt because it's in the coasts of the Mediterranean. It's like everyone was there. See, look at us Sicilians. Absolutely. Sicilians are multi-ethnic. Are you joking? You get Sicilians that look like Middle Easterners, Sicilians that look like me, so kind of pale skin but black hair. You got Sicilians with blonde hair and blue eyes because of the Normans when they conquered. You've got Sicilians that look like Arabs. You've got Sicilians that look like they've got red hair and green eyes. It's absolutely multi-ethnic, and because it's the major island in the Mediterranean Sea, where Egypt is around the corner. Literally got Sicily, Libya, Egypt. Unless we want to go all the way back to the first dynasty, but who the heck knows? It's 5,000 years ago. We don't have enough data to discuss details such like that, but for the majority, I think, of its most important periods, Egypt would have been absolutely multi-ethnic, which means there would have been black Egyptians, particularly in the Upper Egypt region. In the Delta, I think there would have been a higher degree of Egyptians. There would have been, if we would look at them now, they would look very similar to the way Egyptians look today. So Egyptians, there would be olive color. People hate me for it. I know people hate me for it, and I will still say it because I don't care about backlash. If I believe in it, I will say it. And mind you, olive is for people to bother to, instead of saying stupid stuff like olive skin. Well, have you ever seen a human with the skin of an olive? Is a stupid, like with green skin, and which is a stupid number one answer. Stupid number two is, well, olives are black, so olive skin is a term in when we discuss a variety of skin tone, and it goes from a brown to a tanned skin tone. There are levels. So when you say olive skin, you're actually talking about, it's an umbrella term. And then when you go to later Egypt, so the times of Cleopatra, who was Greek, then you would have a lot of settlers from Greece, so Mediterranean skin tones at that point that are from that we would call white today. So like modern Italians, modern Greeks, they would be, so not white in the Nordic sense, of course, because this is a stupid people force me to make obvious disclaimers, but whatever. White European or white Southern European skin tones would have absolutely been a thing during the Ptolemaic Egyptian dynasty, including settlements. So it would have been mixed. Egypt was mixed. They can be mad at me as long as they want. If I get to 10 million subscribers, I will extend this notion to the millions of views. Watch me. Anyways, pretty good video so far. I like it.
Iberian and Gaelic cultures, which had little to no cultural continuity with the Hallstatt complex. Basically, there were those who followed the Hallstatt culture who were not Celtic-speaking, and Celtic-speaking peoples who were not of the Hallstatt culture. The prosperous world of the Hallstatt chieftains came to a sudden end around 450 BC, when the increasingly imperialistic Massalian Greeks decided to abandon their old trade connections to instead try and subjugate the Celts, while the Etruscans shifted their trade routes away from the Hallstatt heartland. As a result, Celtic power shifted to the north, evolving into Hallstatt's dynamic successor, the La Tene. The La Tene culture lasted from around 450 to 50 BC.
La Tene culture is fascinating for the material culture and material goods, the swords, the helmets. I love La Tene culture. In fact, I spent more time studying the La Tene culture than the Hallstatt, just for a personal preference and personal bias, I'll be honest with you. But I did study the Hallstatt culture. I got a couple of videos on that too.
And is the most iconic era of ancient Celtic history. Developing in 4 separate tribal centres, principally along the Moselle and Marne rivers, it soon expanded across much of Europe. By 300 BC, the La Tene culture was dominant across Central Europe, France, Luxembourg, Belgium and Switzerland, and later would arrive in Britain, Western Spain and Ireland. La Tene artwork was what the conventional mind considers quintessentially Celtic, featuring cauldrons, drinking vessels, weapons, shields, armor, and jewelry.
Ooh, when it comes to that, I love the shield. I love the helmet that they chose. Shield directly from iconography, swords directly from material culture. The artist is phenomenal. One thing I want to say about these shields, do you notice that this is basically a scutum, variation of the scutum, isn't it? And if you look at it as the center grip, so if we could turn this around, it would have a briefcase grip. What's interesting is that, and I made a dedicated video, unfortunately the algorithm decided that the video wasn't worth it, but I made a video, the origins of shields, specifically focusing on the scutum. And what's interesting is that these most likely originated in Etruria, the original design with the Etruscans, and maybe it's even possible that the very first ones were wood and leather, or just leather, but more likely I think it's leather covered wood, and then it changed into wood with fabric, or wood still with leather, then the iron rim, then the spine, what is called a spina originally, which was wooden, with the boss also being wooden, swapped to iron and or bronze depending. It's very interesting that then these got adopted by the Celts, and then the Romans of course adopted them too. But and eventually you even have some adoption in with the Illyrians, which are over here. But yeah, so it does originate in Etruria, and then they curve, but the Celts maintain the flat type, not the curved type, as far as I remember.
Characterized by stylistic spiral patterns. It is here we slowly transition from relying primarily on archaeological finds and into the written attestations of classical Greek and Roman authors, who, while often biased or misinformed, still give us a workable amount of information in piecing together the Celtic world, its language, politics, society, and religion. The general public may be familiar with the word Gaul, a term often used to refer to the Celts of the La Tene world. This title comes from the old Germanic velhas, meaning foreigner, which the Celts certainly would have been in the eyes of the ancient Germanic tribes. Meanwhile, when a young Roman republic encountered the La Tene Celts across the Alps in northern Italy, they referred to them as Galli, which might have been the name of an individual tribe they applied to the entire ethno-cultural group.
Yeah, as I was saying, I agree.
We will use the words Gaul, Gallic, and Celtic interchangeably, but generally this was not how the peoples in question referred to themselves.
Yeah.
Indeed, a common misconception is that there was ever a linguistically or culturally uniform nation of Gallic people.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. It's a bit like when you say Romance languages. Like, it's similar. Because, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, French, these are all Romance languages, but it's not like we are one Romance nation. And also we have differences in our culture, but you can also see some connections within our cultures. And so it's similar to that. Okay, so I don't want to watch the whole thing. I want to see if they have, so we are skipping society. We're skipping this section of Hallstatt at the end, even though they got a nice thing. I do want to see, there we go, that's the part about the painting in the grooming section. We'll finish by watching the grooming section because I'm interested to see what he says about the body paint, since I have some information on this because I'm preparing a video, and then we'll consider the end of the react so that people can actually watch the original video and finish it up if you enjoyed what you saw, which I think you did because it's a good video.
Personal grooming was highly important to the Celts. For example, both sexes were said to meticulously and painfully pluck all their body hairs.
They did so in Rome as well.
Additionally, there is some truth to the stereotype of the thick Gallic moustache. Depicted often in both Celtic and Greco-Roman iconography, it was likely believed to be a sign of manhood and virility.
It is a sign of manhood.
Gallic warriors were also said to have washed their hair in a mixture of slaked lime and water, which stiffened it into white spikes. Tattoos and skin dyes were not practiced by continental Gauls, and were limited mainly to the ancient Britons, who, according to Roman accounts, rendered a bluish dye from the Assatis tinctoria flower called woad, which when applied to their flesh was said to provide magic protection in battle. Often of cultural or spiritual significance.
Okay, so I got something to say here. So let me hear, because there are a few things I disagree.
To the ancient Britons, who according
there you go, sorry.
Spikes. Tattoos and skin dyes were not practiced by continental Gauls.
You can't make that statement. Kings and generals, you can't make that statement because we don't know that. They were not practiced at that time. If we're talking about period, specifically when we are in contact with the Britons and then we see that the Britons do it, then yes, at that time, in continental Gaul, so in continental Celtic reality, so in Gaul, yeah, nobody was doing it. But we don't know if they did in the past. It's a lot more probable, in fact, that the continental Gauls did practice tattooing and body painting, but then they abandoned it, but the people in Britannia kept it. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there are coins that absolutely show, I'll see if I can find one, but there are coins that show the little thing that you see, the little twist that you see in Brittonic realities. You find this coin in a continental Celtic or Gallic reality, and therefore and it's ancient, so to me that points to a possible origin in the continent, but then it was forgotten, stopped, abandoned, rendered obsolete, changed, but they just preserved it in Britannia. I think it makes a lot more sense, and if I can find the coin, I'll actually look for it right now. So give me 1 second and I will find the coin for you. I hope I can find the coin right now.
And were limited mainly to the ancient Britons, who according to Roman accounts, rendered a bluish dye from the Assatis tinctoria flower called woad.
Yes, so the flower, it's correct. It's a flowering plant of the family Brassicaceae. It's also called glastrum, woad. The Romans call it vitrum. So he's correct when it comes to Assatis tinctoria woad as the plant used to make these. We don't know if this is actual paint or if they are tattoos. It is possible that it's one or the other, maybe both. They're both likely. Also because the term in Latin that they use when they talk about the act of this is the same that they use. It can also be translated as dyeing. It's like when you permanently dye clothing. So at that point, it's like, but is it tattoos then if it's permanent and it has, because in Latin it can have that. So it's possible that these were tattoos, or maybe not. Maybe they were actual paints. When it comes to the color that is mentioned in blue, well, let's look at the actual word. So in Latin, this is either described in two ways. Both Mela and Caesar use the word caeruleum. Caeruleum can translate as dark blue or the color of the sky and the sea, a variety of blue. There is another author that actually uses the term virdis, which means green. It's a little bit of a later author. It's Publius Ovidius, but it does say virdis. So we have two options. It was either blue, or it was green, or maybe it was both, or another possibility is that it was a color a little bit in between. You know, when blue and green, like aquamarina, that's another possibility. But yeah, so great.
Which when applied to their flesh was said to provide magic protection in battle.
Yeah, they also say that it made them horrible in battle. Horrible, maybe in the sense that they would be like, oh my gosh, who the heck are these? Nice video, I enjoyed it. I only disagreed really with one point. So at the end of the day, this was pretty good. So absolutely, if you want to watch the rest, you'll find a link in the description and pinned comment. And I want to say, nice one.